So, Chapter 7 is titled Unemployment and Inflation. But before we get into unemployment and inflation, we need to define what a business cycle is, because it's the business cycle that is going to impact the unemployment and inflation rates. So, all a business cycle is the pattern of real GDP rising and falling. So, you'll recall on our chapter on national income accounting, we defined how we can calculate GDP and then adjust it for inflation to look at the real value. Well, that value of real GDP is not constant. In other words, the economy is either constantly growing and, of course, constantly falling back into recession. So that's all a business cycle is the pattern of the value of output, of the value of real GDP going up and down over time. Now, we know that this pattern is not regular. In other words, we don't know exactly how long an economy is going to be growing. In other words, we don't know how long real GDP will rise, and at the same time, we don't know how long a recession will last. So we don't know how long real GDP will fall. All we know is that it will go up and down over and over again over time. Now, we define a business cycle as having 4 different phases. Those 4 phases are the expansionary phase, the peak, the contraction, and the trough. So you'll notice here that I have each one of those phases defined in addition to be able to also see them on our business cycle graph here. So notice on our graph, on this axis over here, we have real GDP. So in other words, we know that real GDP is not constant. It can go up and down over time. So that's what we see. And then on the bottom axis, that's where we have the year. So in other words, this is time. As time goes on, the years get greater. And so the first part of the business cycle, again, is what we call the expansionary phase. The expansionary phase, sometimes also called the boom, that's when real GDP is rising. So think of that as when the economy is growing, output of goods and services is increasing. So we can see over here on the graph, that's where the business cycle is increasing like so. So whenever the business cycle is in the expansionary phase, then that means that real GDP is going to be rising. The second phase of the business cycle is what we call the peak, and the peak is the point at which the expansionary phase has ended and real GDP has basically topped out. In other words, it's going to mark the end of the expansionary phase and the beginning of the contractionary phase. So we can see the peak here. That's where real GDP is going to stop rising. The third phase of the business cycle is what we call the contractionary phase. So again, the contraction is what nobody likes to hear about, and that is when we are going into a recession. In other words, real GDP is falling, output is decreasing. Now, if it's a severe prolonged contraction, then we can call that a depression also. But again, notice that after we reach the peak and when we go down, the contractionary phase is when real GDP is falling. So that's where we're going down like so. And then eventually we will what we call bottom out and reach the trough. And so the trough is where the contraction has ended, the recession has ended, and we're going to begin the whole phase over again. So we can see here that this is where we bottomed out, and then we'll begin the whole cycle over again. So again, you see how after the trough, real GDP is rising again, and so that means we're going back into the expansionary phase. So again, every business cycle has those 4 phases: the expansionary phase, the peak, the contraction, and the trough. And it's going to repeat itself over and over again over time. So let's say that I gave you a problem like so, where I gave you a graph where we had real GDP on one axis and years on the other axis, and then a corresponding schedule that gave you what the actual value of real GDP was from year to year. With that information, you would be able to graph, that the business cycle. So again, we would see that in the year 1960, according to our schedule, real GDP was 250. So we would just come come up and we would plot our first point at 250 like so. Then we see in 1970 real GDP was 400, so we would come up and we would plot our second point like so. Then we can see that in the year 1980, real GDP was 300. So again, we would come up and plot our third point like so. Then we see in 1990, real GDP was 250. So we would again plot our point like so. And then for the year 2000, it says real GDP was 350. So we would plot our point like so. And then we can go ahead and just connect these dots and identify the different phases of the business cycle. So in other words, if we said where was the expansionary phase of the business cycles during this time period, we would say that the expansionary phase was from 1960 to 1970 right here, plus it was from 1990 to 2000 over here. In other words, both of these we can clearly see real GDP was rising. So in other words, those would both be the expansionary phase. If we said, well, what years were we having a recession? In other words, where was the contractionary phase? Well, the contractionary phase is when real GDP is falling, so the contractionary phase would go all the way from here, 1970, all the way to 1990. In other words, it's all between that 20-year period, real GDP is falling. So that would be, again, the contractionary phase of the business cycle. And then if we were identifying the peaks and the troughs, you would just look to see, first for the peak, where did real GDP stop rising right before it went into the contractionary phase? And we see that would be right here. So in other words, that would be the only peak that we can identify. And then, of course, the trough that we can identify, that would be before real GDP is going to start rising again after we've been in a recession, and that would be right here. So in other words, you would identify 1990 as the trough. So again, if you get a problem like this on your homework, it's very easy to take the information from the schedule, plot the points on the graph, and then identify the 4 different phases of the business cycle. Now, we already established that the business cycle is unpredictable. In other words, all we know is that it's the pattern of real GDP rising and falling over time. However, we don't know for sure how long a recession and how long an expansion is going to last. However, economists have different indicators that they can use that help them to forecast what is happening in the business cycle, or help them understand what is currently going on in the business cycle, or analyze what has already happened in the business cycle. So we have it categorized into 3 different categories. We have what's called the leading indicators, the coincident indicators, and the lagging indicators. The first category of indicators, again, are what we call leading indicators, and these are factors that change before real GDP changes. So therefore, economists use leading indicators to help them forecast, which again is the same thing as saying making an educated guess as to what they think is going to happen in the future in terms of the business cycle. So these are some common leading indicators: unemployment claims, stock prices, consumer expectations, what the interest rate spread is, manufacturing new orders, things like that. So think about it. Suppose that we were looking at unemployment claims, and unemployment claims were currently going up. Well, if more people are losing their jobs, therefore going and applying for unemployment insurance, that could lead us to believe the economy may be headed for a recession. So again, these indicators are used by economists to help them predict what is going to happen in terms of the next phase of the business cycle. Now, that being said, these indicators are not, infallible. It just, again, it just depends. Leading indicators may fall one month, but then they might go back up the very next month. So again, maybe unemployment claims go up this month, but then they go back down the next 2 months. So generally what an economist is going to look at is they'll want to see several consecutive months of a new direction in one of these leading indicators before they actually come out and forecast a change in output. In other words, before they actually say they're predicting that the economy is going to go into a recession, they would want to see several months of an increase in something like unemployment claims. The second category of indicators are what we call coincident indicators, and these are the factors that tend to change at the same time that real GDP is changing. So the most common coincident indicators that we have are the value of payroll employment, what the value of personal income is, and also what is the value of the manufacturing sales. So again, these particular indicators have demonstrated a strong tendency over time to change along with the changes in real GDP. And then our last category of indicators are the lagging indicators. And so these are generally not going to change in value until after real GDP has changed in value. So common lagging indicators include both the duration of unemployment, the inflation rate for services, and also the prime interest rate, which I don't have listed on here, but that generally is also a common lagging indicator. And so again, these lagging indicators are used along with the leading and coincident indicators to identify the peaks and the troughs in the business cycle. So now that we have defined what the business cycle is, how you would graphically draw the business cycle, and what the indicators are that economists use to predict the business cycle, we are now able to go on and move into unemployment and inflation.